Starting out with questions on Slido. This one's to Candig. How do you manage billing, if any, i.e. the data provider is bearing the cost of the analysis requested by the external user?
In terms of Candig, I don't have the complete picture of how billing and costing will work in the Candig model. However, I can say that a lot of the in general, the funding for infrastructure in terms of hardware and software development is usually provided federally and provincially with institutional contributions. We are exploring some cost sharing models for sequencing projects and especially for the long-term storage and the maintenance costs of that data. And as for workflow execution, we'll have to think about how to actually be able to allocate those costs in terms of the number of computational cycles that are required to run those types of workflows.
Right, and so does the model where sort of like Google Buckets where you can say requester pays, does that not work here because of it being a federated analysis as opposed to download sort of environment?
Yeah, in essence, because we move the computation to the data, the requester is not necessarily the person on the hook for the cost of that computation or that request. So then there has to be the understanding of how long the workflow took to execute, how much resources it took, and how do we define the costs of those resources that were used as part of those of that request and that workflow. I can say though that we are building extensive monitoring and logging infrastructure as part of this Candig platform that will help us to track data usage without looking into the data itself, of course, but looking at the usage of data in respect to those computational resources from performance metric standpoint. But that performance metric data could very well play a part of that cost analysis and billing that would need to be done as part of that cost recovery.
Great. And a similar question, who funds Candig as a whole and who funds each province level participant? Is the participation voluntary?
Participation is voluntary. Usually there is a set of agreements that are signed between participating institutions. And in terms of funding, there are various forms of funding, like I said, whether with respect to the infrastructure that is being used or from the data sets that are being brought into the Candig platform. Those have usually been funded through external granting bodies. But in essence, we are still operating in the model of each institution providing what they can in order to advance to understand what works best for everyone in terms of making sure that everybody is contributing equally and receiving those benefits equally. And overall, as the Candig platform grows, we hope that external entities, hopefully from the federal government, will be able to provide the resources and funding in order to make genomic and data sharing in general accessible and available for all institutions who want to join the Candig network.
Great. And then another question for you. There were 5 other parallel national Canadian platforms in flight at the start of 2020. How many provinces, territories have fully committed to Candig?
That's a good question. I unfortunately don't know of all of the other parallel national platforms, so I can't say how in terms of our similarities or anything or differences between them, but in terms of the provinces and territories, currently we have institutions that are based out of the province of Ontario, as well as Quebec and BC. And we always hope to increase that provincial membership to all provinces and territories of Canada.
Great.
Heidi, I'll just add to that. Since I spend a ton of my non-GA4GH time tracking and working with Canadian platforms,
Yeah.
yeah, there are at least 5, maybe more. They've all got different start points, different funding mechanisms. I think the big opportunity for Candig is as a main host of the Terry Fox Marathon of Hope, which is going to be our coast-to-coast, eventually, cancer project. I think that will take it away from some specific smaller research projects. But each one of them have actually got a stance, and I think one of the roles that Lindsay and I play is how do you make sure that those 5 platforms are interoperable, and of course Global Alliance, we pitch Global Alliance standards so that at least they can compete on the things that are not about interoperability. They can compete on their implementations.
Yeah. Shaikh, is it possible in the system you've built to have participants provide consent for each analysis performed on their data? And if so, how is consent recorded?
In regards to consent, we are in the process of building a dynamic consent platform, which one of my collaborators and project member, Kat, has presented at the poster presentation. So if you're interested in learning more about the dynamic consent work that we're doing, I highly encourage you to check out their poster on DICONS. But in order to provide the dynamic consent, we know that we will have to use existing standards in order to provide project level consent to data access. Specifically, the consent will have to be tied to the institutional requirements and the data of the institution and where it resides. And one way we are exploring and how to do that is using a GA4GH standard like Duo.
Great. And are the same workflows repeatedly executed if different users run them?
So in regards to workflows, they are executed based on in a number of different ways. One can be for interactive analysis. If a researcher is trying to run a particular workflow and they know in which data set they want to run it against, they can make a request to run that workflow on that particular site. The workflows themselves can be federated across the different sites within the Candig network. But again, as with the design of Candig V2, we have made that decoupling of running workflows and executing workflows we've decoupled the workflow execution from the data access requests. So there are scenarios in which workflows can be executed repeatedly or across all sites simultaneously, but based on the data access level or the type of data that they're requesting, that workflow may not actually be executed because the requesting data is not available for that particular researcher or credential that's been used to execute that workflow.
Got it. And this one is for Benilton. Are there whole genome sequences available for the Brazilian data as well as exome?
For this time, for right now, what you can find is actually whole exome. We are working on the whole genome for 2021.
Mm-hmm. Great. And then Shaikh, thank you for the great presentation. How is consent of participants being managed? Are participants sufficiently informed for all uses of their data?
Right. So as I alluded to earlier, the consents are being consent to participant and data from participant is being managed right now through our DICONS platform, and I encourage anybody who's more interested into learning about the consent work that we're doing to look at the presentation from Kat and essentially right now we are still in that process of making sure that we model the same methods of consent and excuse me, where we maintain the same model of consent that's currently used in the clinical setting. So and that's where the DICON system works.
Right, okay. And then to Benilton, this is a tremendously unique genetic variation, or there is tremendous unique genetic variation in Brazil. Are you layering any additional protections, use, exploitation for indigenous genetic sets?
All right, John, this is a very interesting question, and indigenous data here is extremely complicated for us to get. It does require a bunch of authorizations from the federal government. And honestly, this is not something that we actually have at this particular moment. Although it's always of interest, but we do have a lot of red tape to go through in order to get access to it.
Got it. And actually a related question from myself. You mentioned putting the BIPMED data on LOVD. Is that in the form of whole exome data sets, like individual level data, or is that more aggregate allele frequencies based on a cohort of exomes?
At this point, we are talking about aggregated data.
Mm-hmm. Got it. And then, presumably associated with those exomes are phenotypes, which I imagine may not have consent to put the phenotypic data associated with each of those variants and aggregate data sets. But have you thought about ways to enable controlled access and query of that data, set up any, standards using the search API from Beacon or anything to think about a controlled access use of that data?
Heidi, this is definitely what we are looking at right now. This is something that we want to get actually working in the first semester, 2021. And that's something that has been in the works, really. The joke that I had with Angela earlier was, can I just say that we are going to delete everything and just start from scratch? Because I have seen so many great things being shown only today. And I just want to rebuild everything now using the whole ecosystem that I saw.
Great. Next question. Brazil is very state-based country. Is BIPMED getting broad support from outside Sao Paulo?
Not really. Our support is coming from the state research agency. We are actually getting not if you're referring to financial support, no, but we are actually getting a lot of feedback from people outside the state. So now there are initiatives that are being hosted actually in other centers, and in particular in other Latin American countries. And these guys are now in touch on a constant base, trying to understand how is it that we do proper genomic data sharing in a responsible way. But in terms of financial support, no. But that's something that we would love to get. If we were able to get this particular momentum going, it would be perfect.
Mm-hmm. Got it. And another question for myself, really to both of you, as you think about the implementation of GA4GH standards. I'm curious, you can think about this in two ways. One, we all hopefully understand the benefits of interoperability and applying consistent standards to allow us to share data, enable federated analyses, all of the things that we all, see coming from this. However, sometimes it requires extra work to go use someone else's standards in your own system versus just going forward in an independent, siloed way. And we all have to just think about the long-term benefits of the standards. But I'm curious whether we're at a stage where you're actually, especially when you're starting the project from ground up after standards have been built, are the standards actually enabling you to work more quickly because you don't have to develop the APIs yourself and make a lot of decisions yourself. They've in essence been made by a collective community. And so I wonder if you could comment on, how Global Alliance standards may have eased your work as well as making it interoperable versus, not yet there.
Sure, I can start off with that. So in terms of ease of work and just making the interoperability possible for Candig, having these GA4GH GA8 standards available allows us to have that reach of interoperability within Canada, but also following those same GA4GH standards gives us a path to be interoperable with projects at the international scale as well. Moreover, as we see the international community growing and enthusiastically adopting these GA4GH standards, more and more implementations of those standards are emerging in the open source community as fully created standalone projects. And from that, we're able to adopt those open source projects within Candig and feed back into that ecosystem and that development process. And so we are able to just continue to support and grow with the GA4GH community as it has been growing.
That's great to hear. And Benilton, do you have any comment about that?
Yeah. Actually, in my case, I'm just a guy who is curious about computer science. So implementation is not my strong bit at all. I'm a statistician by training, and by having the opportunity of having data sets, let me put this way, talking to each other on a federated manner, it allows me as a professional to be able to pull power from different sources. In particular, in these cases where I'm working more constantly, there are complex phenotypes where we have like these tiny contributions of sites that are completely dependent on sample size. But now, if I'm able to combine these different sets, right, with different, actually, if I'm able to pull together all this statistical power that is hidden on different data sets that are produced around the world, I'll be able to do my job properly. And if we were not to have something like this, I cannot see it happening at all.
Yeah, well, that's great. Great to hear that we're enabling. And I will just relay a comment that was made in the chat from Guillaume Bork, who comments, the easiest part is not to have to justify our choices, which usually takes the most time. We can simply say we're using GA4GH. So well said. I agree with that. And another question that came in from Heidi Sophia, what other Latin American countries are involved in the growing network?
Yeah, we have great contributions with Mexico and Chile. On the other hand, there is also another, it's a GCRF project that I'm a co-PI with, and it's the Cabana project, where we're bringing together at least 9 Latin American partners towards these bioinformatics solutions to build local capacity.